A bride, abandoned on her wedding day, wandered through the fog, torn, trembling, and lost in despair. The whole town turned away, cold and silent, except for one man, a widowed cowboy, quiet and weathered, standing beside his young son. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply spoke 3 words, low, steady, and gentle. "Come home, miss." And that was the moment everything began. 3 simple words that opened the door to a new beginning and pulled a broken woman back from the edge of despair. Don't go just yet. Let me tell you what happened next. And by the time the wind settles, you'll believe. Kindness still has a place in this world. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story that rides in with the wind to warm your heart. Morning came to Silverbrook not with light, but with a hush. The kind of hush that falls before the snow decides whether to stay or leave. The sky hung low and colorless, as if drained by sorrow. The frost on the wooden porches glittered like the edges of broken glass. The shopkeepers stood in their doorways, breath rising like smoke, eyes half hidden beneath hats pulled low. Even the horses tethered outside the saloon pawed the ground softly, uneasy with the stillness that blanketed the little town. It was a morning that seemed to be waiting for something, or someone, to break its silence. Then she appeared. Clara, a woman barely 30, slender, trembling, barefoot. Her once white wedding dress clung to her like a ghost, its lace torn and stained with the color of the road. Her hair, the pale gold of wheat left too long in the sun, was tangled and damp from fog. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked, and her eyes, oh, those eyes. They looked like they had been emptied of everything but shame. The mist curled around her as she walked down the main street, her breath ragged, her steps uneven, the hem of her dress dragging through the mud like a defeated flag. Silverbrook was a small town, too small to keep secrets for long. The blacksmith paused mid-strike. The preacher froze at the chapel gate, and Mrs. Hartley from the general store pressed a hand to her chest. Someone whispered, "Is that her? The bride from the hill?" But no one moved. The people of Silverbrook had learned that pity was dangerous. It made you part of someone else's ruin. Clara stumbled once near the well, catching herself against the frozen edge of the trough. The sound of her breath was the only sound in the street. She looked around, as if hoping, praying, that someone would say something, anything. But the only thing that answered her was the creak of a swinging sign above the saloon and the faint whimper of a stray dog watching from under a wagon. Her right foot was bleeding. She didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she did, and simply didn't care anymore. There was a tremor in her hands as she tried to fix the torn strap of her gown, but the fabric kept slipping, the lace unraveling with every desperate touch. Then, as she bent to pick up the small handkerchief that had fallen from her grasp, the wind caught it, carried it just beyond reach, landing it near the boots of a boy. The boy couldn't have been more than 7. He was small and wiry, wrapped in a thick brown coat patched at the elbows, a red scarf tied too tightly around his neck. His hair was dark and shaggy, his cheeks flushed from cold, and in his mittened hands he held that piece of white cloth like something sacred. For a moment, he just looked at her, his blue eyes wide, not with fear, but with the simple wonder of a child who didn't yet know what it meant to judge. Behind him, the crowd had parted. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered duster coat the color of old clay. His hat was pulled low, but the gray in his beard caught the morning light. His face was lined deep, carved by years of wind and loss, yet his posture carried the quiet steadiness of a man who had endured and kept enduring. Elias Stone. A cowboy who'd once had more cattle than neighbors, and more grief than he ever spoke aloud. They said the storms had taken everything from him: the herd, the barn, the woman he loved. But what remained was a kind of silence that seemed to command the world to respect it. Clara's gaze met his, uncertain, almost frightened. Elias looked at her for a long moment, not the way the others did, not like she was something to whisper about, but as though he saw something beneath the ruin. Then, without moving closer, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, and strangely warm despite the cold. "Come home, miss." 3 words, simple, unadorned. Yet in that still morning, they carried farther than a sermon ever could. Clara froze. The fog seemed to thicken around her, the air trembling with something unspoken. She tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. No one in Silverbrook had spoken to her with kindness since the wedding that never was, the one that had ended before the vows could be said. She didn't even know this man, but in his tone there was no question, no pity, only an invitation, or maybe a promise. The boy, Micah, stepped closer, holding out the handkerchief. "You dropped this, ma'am," he said softly, his voice shaking just a little. Clara looked down at him, then at the fabric in his hand, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. For a moment, her reflection flickered in his eyes. A stranger, broken and lost, yet still someone worth saving. The murmurs from the street faded. The wind shifted. Elias turned his head slightly, as though listening to something distant, a sound only he could hear. Then he placed a gloved hand on his son's shoulder, nodded once toward Clara, and without another word, started walking back the way he came. The boy hesitated, looked up at the woman again, then followed. For a long while, Clara stood there, unsure if she'd imagined the whole thing. The fog wrapped around her like a shroud. Behind her, the people of Silverbrook began to move again, doors closing, curtains drawing, boots scuffing against the frozen dirt. The town resumed its heartbeat, pretending nothing had happened. But she couldn't shake the sound of his voice, that quiet, steady voice that had cut through the cold like a spark in the dark. When she finally turned to follow the footprints they'd left behind, one large, one small, the snow had already begun to fall, soft and soundless. It covered the street, the trail, the shame she carried on her shoulders. And that was how it began. Not with a miracle, not with music or applause, but with 3 quiet words spoken by a man who knew too much about loss. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed. Somewhere ahead, a horse snorted softly in the mist. And in between, Clara Wynne took her first uncertain step toward something she hadn't felt in a long time. The faint, fragile pulse of being wanted again. And the wind swallowed what remained of the morning. The road that day had led her out of the fog and into a silence she had never known before. Snow had already begun to fade into the thawing days of late winter when Clara stepped into the quiet of the stone ranch. The cabin stood at the base of Pine Hollow, a place not built for beauty, but survival. Its wooden walls creaked with every gust of wind, as though remembering all the storms they had endured. Smoke drifted thinly from the chimney, and the faint smell of pine and ash filled the air. Inside, the fire was small but alive, fighting the cold the same way its owner did, quietly, stubbornly. Elias Stone rode out before dawn each day, a dark figure against the pale horizon. He repaired fences split by wind, hauled water for the remaining horses, and moved with the calm precision of a man who had long ago stopped expecting life to be fair. His son Micah filled the silence he left behind with laughter, the kind that carried through the rafters and reminded the old house that something still breathed inside it. Clara, however, moved like a ghost between them, careful, invisible, as if she feared she might vanish completely if anyone looked too closely. The ranch was simple: one main room with a stone hearth, two narrow beds in the corner, and a table scarred by years of meals, work, and grief. The wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, whispering secrets from the valley below. Sometimes Clara thought she could hear voices in that wind, fragments of the past calling her by the name she no longer wanted to answer to. She would wake in the middle of the night, clutching her blanket tight, unsure whether the sound outside was a coyote's cry or her own heart breaking all over again. By morning, she busied herself to hide the trembling in her hands. She scrubbed dishes already clean, swept floors that had no dust, folded the same blanket twice. Every movement was too precise, too careful, like someone trained to anticipate the moment before punishment came. When she poured water from the kettle, she kept her eyes down, shoulders tight. If a chair creaked behind her, she flinched. Even silence felt dangerous, because in her old life, silence always came before pain. Micah tried to talk to her sometimes, about the stars or the horse he wanted to name after her, or the biscuits his father used to make before his mother died. She would nod, smile faintly, and return to her work. There was kindness in her face, but something behind it was locked away. And Elias, seeing that, never forced the door open. One evening, a storm rolled down from the ridge, the kind that howled through every crack in the walls. Elias returned late, his coat heavy with snow, his hands numb. He said little, only nodded toward Clara as she stirred the pot by the fire. Micah chattered about the day, about the tracks he'd seen by the creek, but his father's replies were quiet grunts, tired, soft, content to listen. The rhythm of their lives was wordless, built not on talk, but on presence. The steady beat of boots, the whistle of the wind, the soft crackle of wood. Clara moved carefully around the fire that night. Her sleeves rolled up, face flushed from the heat. She ladled broth into a bowl. The steam fogged her vision, and when she turned, her hand brushed the edge of the kettle. A single moment, a slip, a gasp, and boiling water cascaded down her arm. The sound she made was small, but it sliced through the room like glass. She fell to her knees, clutching her arm, the skin blistering red almost instantly. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Please, I'll fix it. Don't hurt me." The cabin went still. Micah froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Elias set down his cup. For a moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against the window, soft, relentless. Then Elias crossed the room. He didn't speak. He took a rag from the table, dipped it in the cold water bucket, and knelt beside her. The light from the fire caught the silver strands in his hair. His face was unreadable, carved in the same silence he always wore, but his hands, rough, scarred, steady, moved with a gentleness that made Clara shake harder. He wrapped her arm carefully, the cool cloth hissing against the burn. "You'll be all right," he said quietly, not as a command, but as a truth spoken to steady her. When she tried to pull away, he shook his head slightly, eyes still lowered. "Don't be afraid." Clara couldn't breathe. The words were simple, but they landed in a place inside her that had long been empty. No one had spoken to her like that in years, without blame, without demand. Her vision blurred. She thought it was the pain, but the tears came before she could stop them. Elias didn't look at her crying. He just stayed there, kneeling on the wooden floor, until her trembling eased and the firelight softened again. Micah brought her a blanket, draped it over her shoulders without a word. He looked up at his father, unsure what to do next. Elias only nodded, the faintest ghost of a smile flickering across his face. Not pride, not relief, but something like quiet faith that perhaps the world hadn't broken completely yet. When Clara finally lifted her eyes, she found him watching her, not with pity, but with sorrow. The kind of sorrow that doesn't reach for you, but waits patiently for you to reach back. In that silence, something inside her loosened, a thread, a breath, a memory of warmth. Outside, snow began to fall again. Each flake pressed softly against the glass, melting slow, like tiny hands tapping to be let in. The sound filled the cabin, faint, rhythmic, steady. It was the first night Clara didn't fear the quiet. She sat by the hearth, wrapped in the blanket, her arm bandaged and aching, and for the first time, the silence didn't hurt. It simply was, and in that stillness, she realized that not all silence was cruel. Some of it could hold you gently, the way the wind held the falling snow. By the time the snow melted off the fences and the first shoots of green dared to break the soil, Clara had learned the rhythm of the stone ranch. The mornings began with the creak of the porch under Elias's boots and the soft snort of the horses waiting for feed. The days unfolded with Micah's laughter skipping through the air like pebbles tossed into a quiet stream, and the sound of Elias hammering a loose hinge or driving a nail where the wind had pulled one free. The place was still quiet, but it was a quiet that breathed now, not the kind that suffocated. Clara moved through it like someone relearning how to exist. She knew which floorboard moaned beneath her feet, how the kettle sang when the water was ready, and when to lift her face to catch the smell of pine smoke drifting in from the hollow. There were small mercies in the routine. The sight of the sun warming the edge of the pasture, the low whicker of the horses when Elias passed. Sometimes she caught herself humming while she worked, though she never noticed until Micah grinned and said, "You sound like the sparrows, Miss Clara." It startled her every time, not the sound of her own voice, but the fact that it was still there. But ghosts, she learned, don't leave easily. They live in the folds of memory, in fabric that once knew your joy. One morning, she found her old wedding dress folded at the back of the trunk. The lace was stiff from cold, yellowed by smoke and time, but still carried the faint, cruel scent of lilies. For a long while she sat on the edge of the bed, the dress pooled in her lap like a wounded thing. The cabin was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the faint rustle of wind against the shutters. When she finally stood, it was with the kind of resolve that comes from exhaustion rather than courage. She filled a basin outside with water from the well and began to wash the dress. The fabric floated ghost-like in the basin, and the water turned the color of the past, dull, gray, and cold. Her fingers, reddened by the chill, traced the torn seams, the stains no soap could lift. When she wrung it out, it hung heavy in her arms, as though it didn't want to let go. She carried it to the fire pit behind the house, where the earth was still damp and blackened from the last storm, and laid it down across the stones. The morning sun was pale, the kind that doesn't promise warmth, but pretends to try. Smoke curled from the chimney. Somewhere nearby, a horse stamped its hoof against the thawing mud. Clara looked at the dress and thought about what it had once meant. Not love, not safety, but an idea she had buried herself inside. And she realized she was tired of being haunted by a ghost that still wore her name. She knelt by the pit, her hands trembling as she struck a match. Then, the sound of laughter, quick and bright, broke through the stillness. Micah came running across the yard, his coat flapping open, cheeks pink from the morning air. In his hands, he clutched something small, wrapped in a bit of cloth. "Miss Clara," he called, breathless, his voice tumbling over itself. "Wait!" She turned, startled, the match burning low between her fingers. "Micah? What is it?" He stopped beside her, panting, the cloth bundle slipping in his hands. Papa said to keep these for someone good." He managed and opened it carefully. Inside lay a pair of small shoes, worn but polished clean, the leather soft and dark as coffee. The laces were frayed, the soles thin, but they gleamed in the sunlight like something precious. Clara stared at them, the match trembling in her hand until it burned her fingers and she dropped it. "For someone good?" she repeated softly, as if the words themselves were too fragile to hold. Micah nodded, his smile shy but proud. "They were my mama's. Papa made them for her when they first came here. He said they should go to someone who makes the house feel like home again." Clara's breath caught. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of hay and ash, and something else. Something warm. She knelt, running her fingers over the shoes. They were too small for her feet, but big enough to hold the ache in her chest. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Instead, she looked toward the corral, where Elias stood leaning against the fence, his arms folded, watching. He wasn't close enough to hear their words, but he didn't need to. His hat shaded his eyes, yet even from a distance she could see the quiet understanding in his face. He didn't smile, didn't move, only nodded once, as if to say he'd already said enough. Micah set the shoes gently in Clara's hands. "You don't have to burn that," he whispered, glancing at the dress. "It's just a dress." Clara looked down at the fabric, then at the boy. "No," she said softly, her voice breaking but steady. "It's not just a dress. It's what I thought my life was supposed to be." Micah tilted his head, puzzled in the way children are when faced with grown-up grief. She smiled at him, a small, crooked smile that trembled like the flame she had dropped. "Thank you, Micah," she whispered, and he nodded solemnly, as if he understood more than he should. He turned and ran back toward the barn, his boots kicking up bits of thawing snow. Clara stood still for a long moment, the shoes pressed against her chest, the dress lying limp by the fire pit. The wind picked up, tugging at the lace. She looked at it, at what was left of her past, and realized she no longer needed to destroy it. She could let it stay, not as a wound, but as a scar. When she looked again toward the corral, Elias was still there. He met her gaze across the yard. No words, no nod this time. Just a long, steady look that said everything silence ever could. The kind that fills the space between two people learning to trust the world again. And for the first time in years, Clara didn't hide her tears. She let them fall freely, hot against the cold air, shining in the sunlight that filtered through the melting snow. She didn't know what to call what she felt, Relief, sorrow, gratitude, only that it didn't hurt the way it used to. Somewhere between the smoke and the laughter, something inside her had begun to thaw. The wind carried the scent of pine through the open field, brushing past her hair, lifting the hem of the dress one last time before it settled back to the earth. The horses snorted softly. The creek murmured under its crust of melting ice, and Clara stood in the middle of it all, a woman still fragile, but no longer broken. The sun that morning felt strange, heavy, sharp-edged, and too bright for spring. Heat shimmered above the grass, carrying the hum of insects and the faint creak of wood from the old barn. Clara had just finished sweeping the porch when she heard Micah's laughter drift through the yard. It was the kind of laughter that always loosened the weight in her chest, bright and full, scattering through the still air like a melody too innocent for the world it lived in. She shaded her eyes, watching him chase a moth through the pasture, the tiny creature flashing silver under the light. Elias was at the far end of the corral, tightening the fence line. The horses swished their tails lazily, their coats gleaming like copper under the sun. One of them, a gray mare with a pale blaze down her nose, stamped at the flies and snorted. Clara smiled faintly at the sound. The day looked like peace should look, ordinary, simple, almost happy. And that's why she didn't notice the shadow in the grass right away. That subtle ripple between sunlight and stillness. That whisper of danger the world gives before it takes something back. Micah crouched near the haystack, hands outstretched toward the moth resting on a tuft of wild grass. Clara's heart skipped, a flicker of instinct pulling at her breath. At first, she thought it was just the light shifting, but then she saw it. The slow, deliberate coil tightening just beyond the boy's boots. The shape was small but sinuous, patterned in brown and gold, and when the sun hit it just right, she saw the glint of scales moving like liquid earth. "Micah," she called softly, trying to keep her voice calm, but the word caught in her throat. He didn't hear her. The moth had fluttered again, and he leaned forward, hand outstretched, eyes wide with the thrill of catching something so fragile. Then the grass hissed. Clara moved before she could think. She ran, her feet sinking into the soft earth, the air slicing past her ears. She saw the snake's body flash upward, heard the dry snap of its tail, and then pain. White-hot, searing, merciless. It struck her forearm just as she shoved Micah backward, sending him sprawling onto the ground. The sting burned through her like fire under her skin. For an instant, the world went silent. Even the birds stopped. Then came the scream, ragged and desperate, torn from her lungs before she knew she'd made a sound. Elias's head snapped up. The hammer fell from his hand. He was running before the echo of her cry had even faded. Micah was shouting her name, his small voice trembling between fear and guilt. Clara staggered backward, clutching her arm, the punctures already swelling, 2 crimson pearls rising from her flesh. The snake retreated into the grass, its body rippling away like a cruel thought disappearing into memory. Elias reached her in seconds. "Let me see," he said, voice steady but eyes sharp. When she tried to pull away, he caught her wrist gently, unwrapping her fingers from the wound. The sight of it, the angry red swelling, the dark line creeping toward her elbow, made him swear under his breath. "Micah, fetch me the knife. Now." Micah froze. "Pa!" "Now, son." The boy ran, stumbling over the dirt, and came back clutching the small blade Elias used for mending tack. Elias took it, his movements swift and sure. "Hold still," he murmured. Clara's eyes widened in panic, but before she could protest, the blade had kissed her skin. A quick, shallow cut, followed by the sharp pull of his mouth drawing the venom away. She gasped, the world tilting, heat flooding her veins. Elias spat, wiped his mouth, and pressed a cloth tight against the wound. His hands shook, just barely. "We'll keep the arm elevated," he said, mostly to himself. "You'll be all right." Micah hovered beside them, tears streaking his dusty cheeks. Is she gonna die? Elias looked up, not at the boy, but past him, at the line of hills burning gold under the sun. "Not today," he said. He lifted her, her body limp against his chest, and carried her back toward the house. The distance felt longer than it ever had before. The porch steps groaned as he climbed them, each creak echoing the hammer of his pulse. He laid her gently on the bed, the thin quilt fluttering beneath her like wings too weak to lift. The fever came quickly. By afternoon, Clara's skin burned beneath a sheen of sweat, her lips cracked, her breaths shallow. Elias sat beside her, grinding herbs he barely remembered learning the names of, wetting a cloth for her forehead, whispering words he hadn't spoken in years. Prayers, promises, half-remembered hymns from his mother's Bible. Micah kept to the corner, clutching his knees, too scared to cry, afraid that sound itself might make things worse. Outside, the day folded into dusk. The sky bled into crimson, the air thick with the scent of earth and smoke. Elias didn't leave her side. He wrapped her arm again and again, changed the water when it grew warm, and watched the shadows climb the walls. The hours bled together, the way long nights always do when you love someone who might not stay. Sometimes he thought she murmured his name. Sometimes he imagined it. Once, her hand twitched against his, her fingers seeking something in the dark, and he caught them, holding on. He didn't let go again. By midnight, her fever broke into tremors. Elias sat slumped forward, eyes red, whispering softly. "You're all right, Clara. You're all right." His voice cracked, the words tumbling into silence. The fire burned low, casting a faint halo around them, and the sound of the wind outside softened, as if the world itself had decided to rest. When dawn finally crept over the ridge, pale and hesitant, Elias was still there, head bowed, hands entwined with hers. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had stolen him for a moment. The sunlight touched his face, tracing the lines time and sorrow had carved there. Clara stirred. The light was gentle, almost tender, as it slid across the room. She blinked, her eyes heavy, then looked at him. The man asleep beside her bed, still holding her hand as if letting go would undo everything. Her throat ached, but she managed a whisper. "You didn't have to." Elias's eyes opened. For a heartbeat, he looked lost, like a man waking in a world he hadn't expected to see again. Then he breathed out, rough and low. "I did." Clara smiled, faint, weak, but real. The kind of smile that hurts because it comes from somewhere deep. Outside, the first morning birds began to sing, their notes fragile but unwavering. And in that silence, that tender, waiting silence, love drew its first breath. The morning came slow and golden, carrying that strange quiet only late summer knows, when the heat has begun to loosen its grip and the air tastes faintly of dust and distance. Clara woke to the sound of Elias chopping wood outside, each strike steady, familiar, almost comforting. The coffee pot simmered on the stove, the smell of pine smoke curling through the cabin. It should have been a peaceful morning. But that was when the letter arrived. Elias brought it in with the rest of the morning chores, the envelope resting in his calloused hand like something he didn't quite trust. There was no seal, no return address, just her name, written in a hand that dragged old memories behind every line. He placed it on the table without a word. The paper was thin and coarse, smudged as though it had been written in haste or anger. Clara stared at it for a long while, her pulse quickening though the room was still. When she finally opened it, only one sentence stared back at her, sharp as glass and twice as cold. "You humiliated me, Clara. You still wear my name." The world went quiet. The air in her lungs turned heavy. She folded the paper once, then again, as though she could make the words disappear through sheer force. Elias didn't ask to read it. He didn't need to. Her silence was enough. He took it gently from her trembling fingers and, without speaking, dropped it into the fire. The flames caught fast, curling the edges until the ink turned to smoke. "Some words," he said quietly, "don't deserve to live twice." The rest of the day passed in muted tones. Micah played with his hoop and stick near the corral, the soft rhythm of wood against dirt echoing faintly through the stillness. The horses swished their tails at flies, the air humming with heat that hadn't yet given up. Clara worked in silence, her mind a restless tide between shame and defiance. That night, after Micah had gone to bed, Elias sat by the fire sharpening his knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel against stone filled the room like a steady heartbeat. Clara sat across from him, mending one of Micah's shirts. The firelight caught her profile, the line of her jaw, the small scar the snake had left. It glowed faintly, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. After a while, Elias reached for a small wooden box on the mantel. He opened it, pulled out a folded, yellowed clipping, and held it for a long moment before handing it across the table. "This came through Silverbrook 5 years ago," he said softly. "I kept it." Clara unfolded the paper carefully. The headline, though faded, was still legible. "Reporter exposes railroad bribery. Clara Wynne risks career and life to uncover corruption." Her breath trembled. The ink blurred before her eyes. She remembered that story, the sleepless nights, the threats, the way truth had burned brighter than fear, until fear finally won. That article had cost her everything. Her work, her reputation, and the safety she thought she'd found in marriage. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I found it back then," he said. "Kept it because it made me believe decent people still existed." Clara's voice broke when she asked, "Why tell me now?" He looked at her, steady, unflinching, sure. "Because you should know what I saw in you long before that wedding ever happened." For a long moment, neither spoke. The firelight flickered between them, painting gold along the edges of his worn hands and the soft lines of her face. The air between them shifted. Not quite love, not yet peace, but something gentler than either. Outside, the wind brushed against the walls, whispering through the trees like a secret too old to name. The next morning, it dawned hazy and warm. The hum of crickets rose from the grass, and the sound of wheels creaked in the distance. A coach making its slow way up the road from Silverbrook. Elias was the first to step outside, wiping his hands on his coat as the stage came into view. When it stopped, a man stepped down, tall, broad-shouldered, with the stiff posture of someone used to command. His coat was dark and city-made, his boots polished to a shine that didn't belong in the dust of Pine Hollow. His hair was black, combed back smooth, and a thin mustache framed his mouth in a line that never quite softened. He scanned the ranch with disdain, his gaze landing finally on Clara standing at the porch. His expression shifted, Satisfaction, maybe, or something colder. Clara, he said, his voice smooth as oil, you're a hard woman to find. Elias stepped forward, slow and deliberate. You have business here, mister? The man smiled without warmth. Charles Whitmore, he said. And yes, I've come for my wife. The word hit like a hammer. Clara's stomach turned, her pulse stuttering. Elias's stance changed, still calm, but with a quiet force beneath it. You'd best watch how you speak, he said evenly. There's a child here. Whitmore's eyes flicked toward Micah, who stood frozen near the fence. So this is the life you've built, he sneered. A stray woman playing house with a cowboy and his brat. You think you're free, Clara? You still wear my name. Her hands clenched at her sides. You have no right. No right? He said, stepping closer. You're mine. Elias moved then, one step forward, steady and unyielding, his shadow falling long across the dirt. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. You should leave. Whitmore's smirk faltered. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. The wind shifted, stirring dust between them. Then Whitmore straightened his gloves and said softly, almost with satisfaction, This isn't over. I'll be back before sunset. He climbed back into the coach, the door slamming like a gunshot. The wheels rolled away, leaving only the silence, deep, brittle, waiting. Elias stood motionless, watching until the sound disappeared down the road. Clara's heart pounded, her body trembling not from fear, but from the old, familiar exhaustion of a past that refused to die. When she finally looked up, Elias's gaze met hers, quiet, resolute. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. And by sunset, Silverbrook was holding its breath again. The morning broke quiet over Silverbrook, the kind of quiet that comes before change. Soft light slipping through the cottonwoods, the faint ring of a bell calling children to the small chapel by the river. Clara was there, her hair pinned loosely beneath a straw hat, chalk dust on her fingertips as she guided a row of little hands tracing letters on slates. The children's laughter spilled through the open windows, mingling with the murmur of the river below. For the first time in years, her voice held no tremor, only calm. A woman building something new from all that had once been broken. The sound of boots shattered that calm, heavy, determined, and wrong. Charles Whitmore stepped through the doorway, the morning light cutting across his face like a blade. His city coat was rumpled from travel, his eyes hard with pride and bitterness. You're coming with me, he spat, his voice thick with possessive venom. You're my wife. The room fell still. The children froze, pencils trembling mid-air. Clara stood slowly, her hands steady though her heart thudded in her chest. You should leave, she said softly, not in fear, but in quiet defiance. But Charles took a step closer, his gloved hand rising as if to seize her wrist. Before he could touch her, a shadow crossed the threshold. Elias. His coat was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the veins on his forearms standing taut like drawn rope. His jaw was set hard, eyes dark and steady, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply stepped between them. She belongs to no one, he said, his voice low and sharp as steel cutting frost. And you'd best remember that before you draw another breath. Charles laughed, a short, brittle sound, then swung. The punch landed wild, fueled by pride and whiskey instead of strength. Elias didn't flinch. His return strike came clean, direct, and final. The sound cracked through the air like a snapped branch. Charles stumbled backward, his hat tumbling into the dust, his pride following close behind. The children gasped, then went silent. Outside, a few townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the noise. For a moment, all eyes were on the man in the dirt, gasping, humiliated, undone. Then, one by one, people turned away. Doors closed. Curtains fell. No one would stand for him anymore. Silverbrook had already chosen its side. Charles pushed himself up, his mouth bleeding, his eyes full of something almost like disbelief. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Elias wiped the blood from his knuckles, his voice flat. "Not likely." And with that, Charles Whitmore, once her captor, now nothing more than dust, stumbled toward his waiting carriage and disappeared down the road that had brought him there. When the last echo of wheels faded, Clara finally exhaled. Her knees trembled. Elias turned to her, his face still tight with adrenaline, but his gaze softening the moment it found hers. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, tears pooling though she smiled through them. "I am now." That night, Silverbrook was alive again with sound, a quiet hum of life returning to its rightful rhythm. The lanterns along Main Street glowed amber against the dusk, and someone played a slow fiddle tune near the saloon, the kind that sounds like forgiveness. Clara sat on the porch with Micah, helping him tie twine around a small wooden bird he'd carved. Elias was mending the fence in the fading light, his movements slow but sure. The storm had passed, but its echo had carved new peace in all of them. Weeks drifted by like soft dust over the valley. The world was still marked by scars, but now they gleamed instead of stung. One afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of pine and rain, Clara returned to the little trunk beneath her bed, the one she hadn't opened since the day she fled San Rio. Inside lay the wedding dress, torn once, now mended. The fabric yellowed but clean, stitched with care by her own hands. She lifted it gently, feeling the weight of its past, and the freedom in no longer fearing it. The sun was low when she stepped outside wearing it. The dress caught the golden light, its hem brushing the grass like memory turned to grace. Beneath the great pine by the river, people had gathered quietly. Neighbors, children, faces familiar from days of toil and storm. Micah stood beside Elias, his small hand gripping his father's. The preacher waited with a smile that knew the story better than any sermon could tell. When Clara reached them, Elias turned, his eyes filled with awe and something tenderer than words. "You sure about this?" he whispered, though his voice trembled on the edge of joy. She smiled, the breeze lifting a strand of hair from her face. "I was sure the moment you said, 'Come home.'" The preacher cleared his throat, the river murmuring behind him like an amen. "Do you, Elias Stone, take this woman?" Elias's hand tightened around hers. His voice cracked just once as he spoke. "The first time you wore this dress, you were left standing alone. This time I'll stay. Always." And when Clara answered, her voice was steady and bright as sunlight through pine needles. "Then I won't be afraid of the wind anymore." Laughter rose from the crowd, from the boy, from the man who had once sworn never to hope again. The wind caught it, carrying it down the valley, over the river, past the chapel where she had first stood trembling, and toward the little stone ranch that now waited for them. That night, the sky blazed with stars. The world felt wider, lighter, whole. Micah slept curled in a quilt by the hearth, and outside the horses shifted softly in the dark. Elias sat on the porch, Clara beside him, her head on his shoulder. They said nothing for a long while. They didn't have to. Because home isn't built from walls. It's built from the hands that choose to stay. It wasn't a miracle, nor the act of a hero. Just kindness, warm and steady, brave enough to stay when everyone else had turned away. The story of Clara Wynne and Elias Stone isn't about a broken wedding, but about two souls who met in the cold and chose to believe in something good again. In the quiet of loss and loneliness, they found something simple yet extraordinary: compassion, understanding, and a home not built from wood or stone, but from trust and the courage to remain. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if stories like this still warm your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next flame that drifts in with the wind to light your soul. Thank you for walking this road with us. May your day and your heart be peaceful and warm.